Initiating central space control, 1d4 immediately contests crucial squares and prepares piece development, shaping the game's strategic landscape from the outset. Securing the center and preparing for flexible development, knight poised for action. Securing central space and challenging black's knight for immediate piece activity. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to develop the bishop, this establishes a resilient Indian defense framework. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside development, this allows flexibility for further queenside expansion. Establishing central pawns immediately forces white into a decision about how to handle the pawn tension. Solidifying the center, this develops another piece and prepares for potential pawn advances while maintaining flexible pawn structures. Sharpening central contention, black pins a knight, immediately challenging white's setup and potentially disrupting pawn structures. Opening the center for queenside development and potential pawn breaks. Reclaiming the pawn secures black's central pawn majority, a crucial advantage for future positional play and potential kingside pressure. Pinning the knight against the queen immediately creates tactical complications, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the d-file and disrupt black's pawn structure if they decide to capture the bishop. Challenging the bishop directly, this pawn advance seeks to gain space on the kingside and potentially force a concession or a retreat, disrupting white's setup. Recapturing the pawn on the d-file opens up lines for white's pieces, particularly the queen, and frees the bishop from its pinning duty, now eyeing the kingside. This repositioning avoids unnecessary pawn weakness while maintaining piece activity and preparing for future central expansion or knight development. The bishop's retreat indirectly bolsters the pawn chain and subtly threatens a kingside attack down the g2a8 diagonal, creating a quiet pressure that black must acknowledge. Challenging white's central grip, this pawn thrust ignites a dynamic struggle for piece activity and potential outpost creation, immediately complicating the otherwise orderly queen's Indian structure. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing for kingside development, this bishop retreat gracefully sidesteps immediate tactical skirmishes while aiming to castle, thereby securing the monarch behind a sturdy pawn shield and potentially opening lines for the rook on the h-file later. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the e4 square, a crucial battleground in these queen's gambit declined variations. Consider how this knight's placement might influence the potential pawn breaks later in the game and its influence over the d4 and e5 squares. Asserting dominance on the queen side, this move aims to provoke a reaction from black's knight and potentially disrupt its defensive structure, creating an imbalance that could be exploited later. Unleashing the queen to a5 creates immediate pressure along the diagonal, challenging white's bishop and potentially disrupting its defensive coordination. This aggressive posture forces white to address the threat, potentially leading to pawn weaknesses or a less harmonious development. It's a bold statement, seeking to seize the initiative through active queen play and a clever repositioning of black's forces. Sacrificing the bishop here fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening lines and creating imbalances that can be exploited later. White gains a tempo, forcing black to recapture and potentially disrupting their queenside coordination. Consider how this exchange might influence the long-term battle for central control and the potential for future piece activity on the newly opened diagonals. The material equality is maintained, but the positional landscape has shifted dramatically, demanding careful calculation and a strategic reevaluation from both sides. Doubling pawns creates a structural weakness on the queen side that might become exploitable later. Instead of accepting this positional concession, consider prioritizing piece activity to offset the pawn formation. This recaptures material but sacrifices central pawn control. The broken pawn chain now presents potential targets. Observe how this impacts the bishop pair dynamic. You've initiated a pawn structure that demands careful defending. Sacrificing the bishop offers a material concession to shatter black's pawn structure. The goal is to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file, aiming for long-term positional advantages and potential targeting of the weakened king. This move initiates a strategic trade designed to alter the pawn dynamics and create new avenues for white's pieces. Shattering the pawn structure on the queen side, black immediately challenges the capture of the knight, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and gain some counterplay. The doubled c-pawns white is left with represent a potential weakness down the road, a structural scar that could be exploited by precise maneuvering and piece activity, particularly if white struggles to activate their pieces effectively or create sufficient compensation for the compromised pawn formation. Opening up the b-file for potential pressure, white solidifies their pawn structure at the cost of some minor piece mobility. Initiating a forceful queen sortie, black seizes a pawn and directly threatens the white king, creating immediate tactical complications. This aggressive maneuver aims to exploit white's somewhat awkward pawn structure and the exposed nature of the king, potentially disrupting white's development and forcing concessions. The subsequent exchange of pieces could lead to an open position where the black queen, now actively participating in the center, might become a dominant force. Re-establishing pawn structure after the capture, this knight maneuver aims to recenter its influence, eyeing the weakened queenside and preparing to participate in the central skirmish that's brewing. Embracing the doubled pawn creates a formidable kingside pawn phalanx that can now serve as a robust shield for your monarch, a stark contrast to the exposed white king amidst its scattered pawns. Asserting control over the open c-file, this move immediately targets black's compromised pawn structure and prepares for potential piece activity along that critical diagonal. A bold gambit for queenside initiative, this maneuver plunges the black monarch into a perilous central exposure, sacrificing pawn structure for active piece play. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately intensifies the struggle, forcing black to defend with precision. The doubling of white's pawns on the queen side, a consequence of recapturing with the b-pawn, has created a rather isolated and vulnerable pawn structure for black's king. Your rook's advance to g8, while seemingly active, might be prematurely committing forces that could be better used to solidify your kingside defense or challenge white's control of open files. Consider the potential for white to exploit the weak f6 pawn and the open g-file if your king's pawn shield is further compromised. Seizing the open c-file with the queen immediately threatens to unravel black's weakened kingside pawn structure, forcing a critical decision about protecting the g-pawn and its potential cascade of weaknesses. Black, facing a potential material deficit and a compromised pawn structure, seizes the initiative by eliminating the attacking queen and initiating an immediate counterplay, prioritizing activity over material balance. Reclaiming the piece solidifies white's material advantage, though the doubled pawns on the queen side present a lingering positional challenge. Pushing the rook forward now is a daring gambit, aiming to leverage the open g-file and create immediate threats against white's king. But it leaves your own king exposed and could lead to tactical complications if white can coordinate their pieces effectively for a counterattack. Securing the pawn advantage, white now marshals forces for a decisive clampdown on black's compromised queenside, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and isolated f-pawn for a clear structural superiority. Unleashing the rook along the open file, black desperately seeks counterplay against white's imposing piece formation, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed kingside pawn structure and potentially create threats on the second rank. Preparing to activate the rook on the now open h-file, white seeks to create immediate threats against black's weakened king position, a consequence of allowing doubled pawns and the loss of the bishop pair. The bishop finds a relatively safe haven on e6, subtly reinforcing the pawn structure and preparing to support potential pawn advances on the queen side while keeping an eye on the now open g-file, a position of relative calm amidst the ongoing tactical skirmishes. Shifting the monarch to f1 endeavors to secure a safe haven, withdrawing from potential skirmishes along the back rank, and preparing to involve the king in the defense of the increasingly exposed pawn structure. Preparing to activate the rook on the open file, aiming for a more dynamic position and challenging white's central control. A strategic repositioning, nb3 aims to exert pressure on the queen side and potentially support a future advance of the b-pawn, while simultaneously preparing to contest control of the now open central files, steering towards an endgame where pawn structure imbalances might be exploited. Re-establishing activity on the queen side, black aims to activate the rook and contest the open files. Preparing to shore up the king's defenses, f3 offers a vital escape square for the monarch while subtly bolstering the pawn chain's structural integrity. A bold territorial grab, this pawn push aims to liberate the queen's bishop and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side. It's a gamble, however, as it leaves the king side somewhat exposed and allows white's knight potential outpost squares. We're entering a phase where piece activity and coordinated pawn structures will be paramount for success. Recognizing the danger of the doubled pawns and the exposed king, white repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to contest the crucial 7th rank and potentially initiate a kingside attack or shore up its own royal position. Reactivating the bishop to its prior diagonal and re-establishing control over key squares, the black bishop now aims to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and prepare for further offensive actions on the kingside, potentially leveraging the open g-file that was previously ceded. Opening up lines around the black king, this maneuver aims to capitalize on the compromised pawn structure created earlier by black's capture on c3. By bringing the rook to the 2nd rank, white prepares for a potential infiltration down the open h-file, aiming to exploit the vulnerable g7 pawn and potentially launch a dangerous attack. Black's pawn push finally breaks into white's territory, aiming to create advanced outposts and potentially disrupt white's structure, even if it does momentarily tie down the rook. Unlocking the knight's potential, this repositioning initiates a dynamic maneuver, aiming to exploit the open files and challenge black's pawn structure, potentially disrupting their queenside coordination. The pawn's advance to a3 seems to be an aggressive attempt to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's coordination on the queenside, but it might be a bit premature, potentially weakening the queenside structure and offering white counterplay against the advanced pawn. Initiating the central pawn break, white aims to shatter black's pawn chain and expose the king's sanctuary. Consider the dynamic potential unleashed by this advance, forcing a reassessment of black's king's safety and piece activity in the ensuing chaos. The aggressive spearhead challenges black's defensive setup, seeking to exploit any lingering structural weaknesses and open lines for immediate attack. This pawn thrust fundamentally alters the board's complexion, potentially leading to a sharp tactical skirmish or a positional squeeze, depending on black's response. Observe how white's timely central push disrupts black's harmonious development, creating opportunities for tactical combinations and positional advantages. Capturing the pawn opens up the kingside for your rooks, creating an attacking potential that, while appearing slightly chaotic, could lead to a rapid checkmate if white isn't careful. Opening a crucial diagonal for the rook, this capture aims to exploit black's compromised pawn structure and isolate the pieces on the queenside. A subtle repositioning to prevent white's knight from accessing the d5 square, while also preparing for further advances along the b-file. Prioritizing king's safety now that black's structure has been so dramatically fractured is paramount. Moving the king from the compromised square on f1 allows it to escape potential immediate threats and creates a more secure retreat path if needed, simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside defense or even a central pivot. This maneuver is about salvaging positional integrity and preparing for the long game, rather than seeking immediate tactical fireworks. It's a subtle but crucial adjustment as the board simplifies and the king becomes a more exposed target in the late middle game. The black rook embarks on a daring raid, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position, but this aggressive infiltration risks becoming a lonely outpost if support doesn't materialize swiftly. Pivoting the king to safety becomes paramount now, as the rook on the d-file is a significant threat, and a well-placed king can organize defensive lines or prepare for a more active role later. Asserting control over the open c-file now presents black with the opportunity to centralize their rook, aiming to coordinate with the bishop and potentially pressure white's isolated pawns on the queen side. Shifting the knight to this square aims to disrupt black's centralized bishop and potentially exploit the weakened kingside, a subtle positional maneuver after the recent tactical exchanges. Unveiling a new layer of complexity, the bishop's retreat to e6 aims to bolster the pawn chain, preparing for potential advances or reinforcing defensive structures along the queen side. Opening the rook's path to the d-file now aims to exploit the isolated pawn on d4 and challenge black's rook on the 7th rank. Unleashing a surprising discovered attack, black forces white's king into a precarious position and disrupts white's coordination, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch with the rook. Disentangling the king from the imminent threats is paramount. This retreat offers a breathing space and begins to reorient the rook towards active defense on the open file. Sensing a tactical opportunity, black seizes the initiative to simplify the position and create counterplay by forcing a liquidation of material. The immediate king relocation to the center opens up its defensive potential and prepares for the impending rook endgame, a critical phase where pawn structures and king activity become paramount. Pawn structure compromised, black aims to exploit the open files and potential weaknesses around white's king. Shifting the king's weight backward avoids the immediate confrontation on the 3rd rank, seeking a slightly more secure position as the queens have been exchanged. But it leaves the monarch a bit exposed to potential threats from black's entrenched pieces on the queen side. Unleashing the pawn chain, this advance disrupts white's king's safety by opening a diagonal for black's rook and creating immediate tactical threats. Unlocking the d-file for potential penetration becomes the primary objective, as this rook assumes a central, assertive post, preparing to challenge black's advanced pawn structure and create new avenues for attack or defense. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, black initiates a crucial pawn race by capturing the central defender, aiming to disrupt white's structural integrity and create active counterplay on the queen side. Sacrificing the king opens up the central files for white's rooks to attack black's king, now exposed by the pawn advance on the king side. Asserting control over the crucial central files, this tempo-gaining check forces the white king into a more exposed position, disrupting any immediate defensive coordination and potentially opening avenues for the black rooks to penetrate deeper into white's territory. Unleashing your monarch into the fray like this, while exciting, exposes your king to a storm of potential counterplay from the black rook and bishop coordination. Consider the immediate threats and potential sacrifices black might employ to exploit this forward king. A crucial moment arises as the black king steps out of its protective pawn shield, venturing into the open where white's rook and knight can combine effectively, creating immediate pressure. Unleashing a pawn's potential, this advance seeks to restrict the enemy rook's maneuverability, potentially creating outposts or forcing awkward piece placement. This unexpected repositioning of the rook to the 4th rank aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and potentially create threats down the file or against the d-pawn if white isn't careful. Challenging the dominant rook outpost on the 4th rank, this knight maneuver aims to disrupt black's attacking setup and potentially liberate white's own pieces from their defensive positions. Seeking to unleash the rook from its confined square and activate it along the h-file seems to be the primary goal, though its potential activity is severely limited by white's pawn structure and king's safety. Seizing the active knight with this capture opens a pathway for your rook to exploit the now undefended pawn on g7, potentially leading to a decisive attack on black's exposed king. Capturing the knight opens a critical diagonal for your king to escape the mating net, but be aware that the pawn structure on the queen side is now quite compromised. The monarch now scrambles towards the wing, an unusual gambit to evade immediate harm, though it leaves a lingering scent of vulnerability in its wake. The king's newfound freedom, while seemingly liberating, opens a dangerous avenue for the rook on the h-file, potentially creating severe threats if not carefully managed. The rook finds its way to the f-file, a strategic redeployment aiming to disrupt black's rook coordination and potentially open lines toward the king. The king, now a vulnerable target on the open center, finds himself harried by the rook's relentless check, forcing a positional retreat and surrendering any hope of centralized activity. The king's journey across the board concludes, now aiming for the relative safety of the queenside corner, a crucial repositioning to consolidate material advantage. Pushing the f-pawn is a bold attempt to create counterplay, leveraging the king's active participation. Committing to a specific square for the king, this maneuver aims to consolidate your remaining pieces and prepare for a potential advance on the queen side, hoping to create a passed pawn while keeping your monarch out of immediate danger. Fulfilling the pawn's potential demands its full advance, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially liberate a passed pawn. The king now bravely ventures out, seeking to activate its own defensive capabilities and perhaps create a passed pawn on the king's side. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking to support its advancing pawns and disrupt white's pawn structure. Seizing the open file, white establishes a strong presence on the queen side, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create new attacking avenues. Unleashing a final desperate pawn thrust, black seeks to disrupt white's consolidated position and create a mating attack before the inevitable endgame loss. The king is forced into a precarious position as it ventures towards the queen side, exposing it to further checks and potential mating nets. Initiating pawn breaks often requires careful calculation, and here, the thrust of Rf4 threatens to create a passed pawn with f3. However, this comes at the cost of leaving the king somewhat exposed to any immediate counterplay that might arise from white's pieces, especially the rook now on the same rank. It's a gamble to advance pawns so aggressively in the endgame without ensuring complete safety for the monarch.